Thank you, Kathy. And thank you all who are gathered with us this evening. It's truly an honor and a privilege to be with you all tonight to talk about restorative justice. I'm Belinda Doolin. I'm the Executive Director of the Dispute Resolution Center, one of 17 community dispute resolution programs in the state of Michigan. I encourage those in the audience, particularly if you are outside of the Washtenaw or Livingston County area, to look for your community dispute resolution program and make a connection with them and participate in the fine work that they're doing as well. The DRC in Washtenaw County also services Livingston County, and for more than 30 years, we've been providing mediation services to the community. For the last 12 years or so, we have been providing services aligned with the principles and philosophies of restorative justice, restorative practices, and peacemaking. I won't repeat the wonderful things that Kathy shared, but please go to our website, thedisputeresolutioncenter.org, to learn more about the services that we offer. Many of you in the audience, I know, and I appreciate you all being here to support our efforts. And because you're connected with our center, you know how important it is for our community to be educated on what this work is about. So I am so pleased tonight to have Seema Gajwani with us as our guest speaker. Seema is an assistant prosecutor from Washington, D.C. They have implemented a restorative justice program, and she's here to share her insight and what she has learned in this journey, and to give us some tips of this trade. We know that it's not done, it's not easy to do, and we've been working at it for a long time, and many of the important components are coming together in our county. Before I turn it over to Seema, I just want to give you a few tips on what's going to happen tonight so that you can know what to anticipate. Seema will take the mic, so to speak, in a few moments. We will listen to her. I'll also serve as the moderator, and we'll have questions for her. And we encourage those in the audience to put questions in the chat or the Q&A box. We have a couple people here, Jermaine Smith and Jillian Jackson, who will be monitoring those parts of Zoom, and they will make sure your questions are brought to my attention. We are scheduled to end this event at 8:30. And we want to make sure that we get as many questions from you all in as possible. But please know that because of time, we may be limited in how many questions that we can address tonight. This is being recorded, so your questions will be with us, and we can circle back, get answers to your questions, and we will post them on the DRC's website, as well as the website for Friends of Restorative Justice. So your voices are important to us, your questions are important to us, but we do want to honor the time that we've allotted for tonight. So without delaying this any further, I want to turn this over to Seema and thank her again for spending her evening with us. I know she's had a long day at her office, but we appreciate her kindness and generosity so much in coming to support us and help us learn about this journey that we are on. Welcome, Seema.
Thank you. Hello to everyone. I'm actually totally honored to be here and to be given this opportunity to speak for some time and to answer questions. I feel really grateful for this honor. I feel very special, so thank you. And in particular, thank you, Carolyn and Kathy from Friends of Restorative Justice. Belinda, thank you so much. And your colleagues at Dispute Resolution Center. I had a wonderful conversation with Belinda last week that really gave me a lot of valuable information about the work that you all have been doing, and really just your interest and commitment and enthusiasm for restorative justice, which is really heartening. I'd also like to say thank you to Cindy Prezio, who is a friend, who I think encouraged you all to bring me here. So thank you, Cindy. And so I'd love to just start to tell you a little bit about myself and my history with restorative justice. It sounds to me like Belinda and Kathy and Carolyn, you all have been doing restorative justice actually even longer than I have. because though now I feel really, really connected to restorative justice, I actually about 6-7 years ago didn't really know much about it at all. And when I did know about it, I was really quite skeptical at that. As Kathy mentioned, I work at the DC office of the Attorney General, and that our office is the exclusive prosecutor for all juvenile crime for Washington, DC. We also have a small segment of adult prosecution jurisdiction at our office, but most adult crime is prosecuted in DC by our federal counterparts at the US Attorney's Office, and that's because of the weird status of DC, which is not a state. But before I came to the prosecutor's office, I had worked on criminal and juvenile justice reform at a national foundation. And for the years that I was funding reform efforts, I was funding things that were very different than restorative justice. They were far more kind of concrete. It was about recidivism reduction and data collection. And what I knew about restorative justice seemed kind of soft and idiosyncratic. And I didn't know how you would do it, and I didn't know how you would evaluate it, and I didn't know why victims would agree to do it. But then at my new job, one day I found myself at a high school called Ballou Senior High School in Washington, DC. It's one of these large public schools. And a woman there was holding a restorative justice conference, which is a restorative justice dialogue between people who've been involved in some sort of conflict. And she invited me to watch. And this is because there had been a fight between two high school students. But it wasn't a fight, really. It was like a beating. One boy just beat the lights out of another boy in a classroom, punching him in the face repeatedly and not stopping until the teacher pulled him off the other boy. And it had been a few days since this happened. It had happened maybe on a Friday, and it was like Monday morning when I was at the school and invited to sit in on this restorative justice conference. But when the smaller boy walked into the conference room that we were in, you could still see these injuries on his face. You could see his, the white part of his eye had red in it, and his face was still quite swollen. For this conversation, I'll call him Darren for privacy. So Darren, his mom and his aunt came in first, and they were talking about how bad Darren's eye had been, and how bad his face looked on Friday, and they were really upset and angry. Darren himself was quiet. And then soon the other boy arrived to our conference room, and I'll call him Malik. And he came in with his mother and his mother's fiance. And the restorative justice facilitator who invited me to sit in, her name was Ivy. And she sat all of us down in chairs that were set up in a circle with no table in the middle. And she went around and did introductions and a few ground rules. And then she asked Malik to tell everyone what happened from the beginning. Now, Malik was way bigger than Darren. He was just like kind of a taller, thicker kid, way bigger. And this kind of made sense to me, right? Big kid pummels weaker, smaller boy, end of the story. But then Malik started talking. He was talking really quietly. He was like hunched over and seemed nervous and embarrassed. And he kept saying my name. He and all the other kids, but it wasn't my name, it was something else. And so it turns out that these other kids had been making fun of his name, and they'd been doing it for weeks and weeks. And this, I guess, was like the last straw. And so Ivy then turned to Darren, the other boy, and said, Darren, tell the group what happened. And he was like, nothing. I just said his name. And then out of nowhere, he got up and started punching me in the face. And so she asked him a couple more times, and he kind of gave the same answer. And then Ivy asked the rest of us to go around the circle and comment on what we heard Darren saying, and if it made us think of anything from our own experiences. And one person said that they didn't think Darren was telling the full story. Another person said that when they were young, they were made fun of for some reason and how hurtful it was. And then it got to Darren's mother, and she said, Darren is a joker, and he likes to joke around, but he does not appreciate how it can get him in trouble or hurt people. And so the circle of people just we just kept talking. We talked for like an hour and a half. Both the mothers talked about the fact that they didn't raise their children like this and how much they disapproved of violence. Malik's mother talked about working 2 jobs and having to commute by bus to provide for her kids, and how she had to take off work on Friday when she got the call, and then again today to come back to the school, and that her boss was going to be very angry. Darren's mom told her son in front of us, she said, you know, people look at Black boys in Southeast DC and they assume they are violent. And she said, I know that you're not violent, but I'm so scared because I don't want you to end up dead. And she started crying. God, this has been years ago. Or as a number. I don't want you to end up as a number. And so as the circle went on, both the parents kind of apologized to each other for what their sons had done. Malik's mother said to Darren's mother, if I see you on the street, you'll know that you have a friend. And she said, you know, I heard a lot of rumors about this fight since Friday in the community. And I heard that the boy called my son a bee, and about how your family was going to bring their people to this meeting. And she said, I woke up this morning and I said, Lord, help me. I'm going to go down to Baloo to brawl today. And that's why I brought my fiance. But then she said, you know, I see that actually we've made friends, and I don't think this should have happened, but I want to thank the boys because it brought our families together. And all the while, the boys themselves are pretty uncomfortable. It was really hard for Malik to admit what he had done to the person that he hurt and their family members in front of all of these people. And Darren eventually admitted the role that he and his friends had played in the taunting of Malik. And it seemed that the boys also didn't often get a chance to hear their mothers talk openly about their hopes and their fears for their sons. And when the moms cried, you could see that the boys were like, their faces were in so much pain. And the adults around the circle, the community itself, not the facilitator, Ivy, and not me, talked to Malik about how violence was not an appropriate response, but they did so in a way that expressed empathy and compassion towards him. Malik's mother's fiance at some point mentioned to the group that he spent some of his free time at a boxing gym, and then he offered to take the boys there to channel their anger in a positive way. And later he actually did that. And Darren's aunt and his mom, I think Darren's aunt, asked Darren, what are you going to do the next time your friends want to tease Malik? And he was kind of like, don't worry, it's going to be fine. But she didn't let it go. She's like, no, pretend I'm your friend. And I say, hey, Darren, let's do this. What are you going to say? And he says, nah. And then he starts responding in character. It's not like that. He is cool. Leave him alone. We dealt with it. We're good. And they go back and forth, and they practiced how he's going to be able to build up the words and the courage to stay out of this kind of thing in the future, and even protect this friend. And towards the end of the conference, you know, the boys apologized to each other. Ivy made them do it twice because she was like, this time you have to do it with eye contact. And then the group came to an agreement about what Malik and Darren had to do. And each promise was written down and signed, how they would behave when they saw each other, what they were going to say to their friends about what had happened, how would they talk about this incident with other people or on social media going forward. And then that was it. We all got up, the moms hugged, the kids did that, you know, shoulder goodbye thing, and then everyone left. And me, I was floored because Darren was hurt with injuries. And in Washington, D.C., Malik would have been charged with assault. I had been a public defender in D.C. for 6 years. That was my first job. And so I knew exactly what would have happened to Malik if he'd gone to court, because I had represented kids who were in that same situation. And after the fight, if he had gone to court Malik would have been questioned and handcuffed and arrested in his school in front of administrators and students. He would likely spend a night or two locked up pending court. And then in court that day, when he went in, he would sit in a cell block for hours until his case was called. And, you know, the one person who would visit him during the time that he's in the back of court in a cage would be his court-appointed lawyer, who was somebody like me, asking about the details of his life and the details of the crime. And to court Malik, his lawyer is the one person who knows the worst of what he's done. And this is what she'll tell him. We can beat this. The government evidence isn't that strong. Don't admit anything. Don't talk to anybody about this. Don't say anything. Let me do all the talking. And as defense attorneys, we need to do this to build trust quickly with our clients and show them and their families that we're on their side, because we're investing into this bank account that will pay us back later when we have to have with them these hard conversations about whether you go to trial or whether you take a plea. But what we're also doing as defense attorneys is we're inadvertently undermining what the research shows is fundamental to a person changing his behavior. That is taking responsibility for his actions. Eventually, Court Malik, his case would be called by a judge, and then the judge and the prosecutor and the probation officer and the defense attorney will all have a conversation in court about his fate. And none of these people know Malik or his family. To them, he'll be what they read in the police report. And frankly, what I first saw when I met him, a large teenage boy who violently assaulted a smaller kid in his class. It's an assault, it's violent, it's a poor Black boy. We've seen this story before. And the prosecutor and the judge will never treat Malik as the kid who struggles in school because he's painfully shy and who lost his father when he was 8 years old, who takes really good care of his little sister. And the prosecutor will look at Court Malik and think about Darren, the victim. And as a prosecutor, it's his job to do justice for the victim, Darren, and his mother, and the community. And so what the prosecutor will do is prosecute fully. And back in the courtroom, a probation officer will stand up and read a report about every worst thing that Court Malik has ever done. And he'll stand there, Court Malik, restrained at his wrists and his ankles with shackles, wearing a jumpsuit next to his lawyer. And the probation officer will talk about his mediocre grades and his spotty school attendance and that he might be hanging with the wrong crowd. And for Malik at his age, who he is and what he thinks of himself is inordinately influenced by what others think about him. And he looks tough and hardened, but Malik's self-esteem is very fragile and his psychological development is vulnerable. And standing there in a courtroom, silenced, ashamed, Court Malik will hear what is thought of him by all of these adults, and then he'll deliver. We contribute to stigmatizing these kids, and then they believe what we've told them, that they are unforgivable, that they are broken, that they are bad, and then we'll blame them for it. And eventually, Court Malik will enter a guilty plea. The prosecutor will never know that Malik felt terrible after what he did. The prosecutor won't know that Malik would have taken responsibility for the fight on the first day of court if he could have. And at no point will Malik have to apologize directly to Darren. And Darren won't have to apologize for his role, however minor it was. And when the judge asks him if he committed the crime, Malik's lawyer will lean over to her client, whisper in his ear, and tell him, now is the time you say yes, in order to take the plea. And to Malik, none of this will feel like accountability. And to the victim, it won't feel like justice either. And Court Malik will then return to school, and the underlying problem between him and Darren won't have been addressed. In fact, now Darren and his friends may be emboldened or prepared for retaliation. And Malik will be the kid who was locked up, who has a probation officer, who is criminal. Turns out that the very nature of prosecuting him produces a Court Malik who is more wounded, who is angrier, and the research shows will likely harm again. And we've all seen this happen. But none of it did happen. What actually happened is that these two boys and their families resolved the issue with accountability and fairness in a 1.5-hour conversation. So you can see why I was floored. And so my office, the Office of the Attorney General, though we are the exclusive prosecutor for all juvenile crime in Washington, D.C., we started a restorative justice program in 2017. And since then, we have had a set of full-time, on-staff restorative justice facilitators who, together with me, have brought together victims of crime and offenders and their families and their supporters for over 250 restorative justice circles. We have successfully used restorative justice in somewhat low-level cases, simple assaults, robbery snatches, thefts, and we've also used restorative justice in stabbings and carjackings and burglaries instead of traditional court processing. Today, in fact, we focus exclusively on serious violent crime. Our restorative justice caseloads consist of robberies, gun offenses, carjackings, and serious assaults exclusively. And the reason we take serious violent crime when the victim is interested is because we know that handling those cases with restorative justice is the best shot that we have at changing behavior of those young people and reducing recidivism. And that's what the research tells us. The most rigorous research on restorative justice to date is a large study of 12 sites that was a randomized control trial. It was done across the UK and Australia from 1995 to 2004, and it covered over 2,000 cases. And these programs are all around these two countries, and they all used restorative justice. They were funded by the same funder, and they were all trained in the same way to use restorative justice as an alternative to the traditional prosecution. But in some of the sites, it was just for juveniles, and some of the sites, it was just for adults, and some of the sites, it was for both. And in some sites, it was only for serious offenses, and in some sites, it was only for nonviolent offenses, and some it was used for both. But what is fascinating is that the report shows that statistically significant reductions were seen in recidivism across the sites. And that's not unusual. There have been many studies that are typically less rigorous than a randomized control trial across the United States in different smaller programs that have showed improved recidivism results as well. But two other fascinating conclusions from this large 12-site randomized control trial study were that number one, recidivism reduction was greater for serious violent crime than for nonviolent crime. And the recidivism reduction was greater for adults than for juveniles. And interestingly, at all of these 12 sites situated across these two countries, it was police officers who facilitated the restorative justice meetings between victims and offender. So it seems that there is like a big question. If restorative justice is more effective at reducing crime than traditional prosecution, why do we still do traditional prosecution? And I think there are a lot of reasons for that are cultural and political and policy. But one of the underlying things about restorative justice that I think is really powerful to understand is the difference between shame and guilt, which Brene Brown talks a little bit about. She says, shame says I am a bad person, and guilt says I did a bad thing. She says shame is highly correlated with things like addiction and depression and self-harm and also violence. But guilt is different. She says guilt is actually inversely correlated with all of those things. With guilt, there is a path to redemption built in because you are not the bad thing. So you can try to be better. You can try to make it right. She says that the ability to hold something we've done or failed to do up against who we want to be is incredibly adaptive and productive. She says it's uncomfortable, and I can attest that restorative justice conferences can sometimes be very uncomfortable, but it's very, very productive. It is hard to face up to something that you've done when you've really messed up, but it's good for you. It's how we learn from our mistakes. And in some ways, that's the heart of restorative justice. I'll tell you the story of one case, which I think speaks to the harm that our traditional justice system causes. It was a case in which a young person, a youth, tried to rob a woman. She resisted, and in a panic, he shot her because he had a gun. And the bullet grazed her face, actually. And so our restorative justice facilitators were referred the case, and the facilitator went to speak to the young person. And the kid is immediately and effusively remorseful. I didn't mean for this to happen. I'm so sorry. Please tell this lady I'm sorry. And then the facilitator goes and speaks to the woman, and she is scared and she's traumatized. But after thinking about it, she is open to doing restorative justice. And so the facilitator works with the victim for a while. Our facilitators work extensively with the victims of the crime, their supporters, and also the young people who are charged with the crime. And so our facilitator, her name is Ashley, she has been working with this victim for some time, for several weeks, but she's in this situation where she's unable to have the victim talk about what happened. She just doesn't want to talk about it. She can't talk about it. And so usually our facilitators don't disclose anything that the other side has said. It's part of the confidentiality protections. But in this case, the facilitator thinks that that might help. So she asks for permission from the boy to tell the woman a little bit of what he said. And he says, yes, that's fine. So our facilitator then goes back to the victim and she tells her that the young person wants her to know that he's so sorry and he hopes that she's okay. And she immediately breaks down into tears, sobbing. And at that point, she's finally able to talk about what happened to her. This was an unusual case. It was a relatively serious case for us at the beginning of when we were starting to take serious cases. And so it was a situation where we ended up going to sentencing, or what we call disposition in juvenile cases, which is very, very unusual. Usually all of our cases are dealt with before sentencing, and then we never go to sentencing if they're successful. It's an alternative to adjudication. But this case was an anomaly for various reasons. And so before the Restorative Justice Conference was actually scheduled to happen, the parties were going to disposition. And it was at the very beginning of the shutdown. So everything was on video and everybody was there on video. There was the judge, the lawyers, prosecutor, defense attorney, our restorative justice facilitator, Ashley, was on there, the boy, his mother, and the victim. And they go through all of these, kind of procedures. And then the judge turns to the victim and instructs her to read her victim impact statement, which she had written, I think, with the prosecutor at the very beginning of the case. And so she takes out her victim impact statement and she reads it. And it's a really long statement. But at some point, it says things like, you should be ashamed of yourself. I hope your mother is ashamed of you. And I hope your father, if you even have a father, is ashamed of you. And then the judge turns to the boy and asks if he has anything to say. He just says no. And he didn't read the letter that he had written for her before the hearing. And the restorative justice facilitator, Ashley, she calls on him later. And he tells her he no longer wants to do restorative justice. And so Ashley calls his mom to see what happened. And his mom said that he was being held at a juvenile detention facility and they have a special room for them to come to do the video conferencing for court. And apparently when he was done with this video hearing, instead of taking him back to his old unit, they had to take him to another unit for youth on suicide watch. And the restorative justice conference never happened because he declined to do it. And I tell you this story because I think it's important to note that even things that we think of in our justice system that are innocuous, we think of as not harmful, like a victim impact statement, they actually can cause a lot of harm and shame when you don't have a full dialogue about accountability and understanding, without the path to redemption, without the ability to talk to each other in person and understand each other as people before you start talking about this really bad thing that happened. Shame and isolation and stigma, these are all features of our current justice system. They're not bugs, they're not anomalies. These are core features of what our system is about. And it turns out that those features actually make us all less safe. They contribute to recidivism. There's new analysis on crime desistance, and that speaks to this a little bit. And desistance is the aging out of crime. So there's this age-old trajectory in criminology, and it's called the age crime curve. It's like the most consistent criminal pattern that they have. And that is that the vast majority of young adults and adolescents will naturally age out of crime or desist from crime over time. It's very durable. And one of the things about desistance is that it's actually a process. It's like, it's like addiction. You don't give up cold turkey typically, I guess not always. There's often some relapses, but it's a process of getting to the point where you give up crime permanently. And there are things that promote aging out of crime, that promote the ultimate stopping of crime. And then there are things that halt it, that actually stop the natural progression of aging out of crime, and they make criminality go on longer. And it's different for different people. For instance, for women, parenthood is more strongly linked to desistance, whereas for men, employment and peer influences are more likely to accelerate or disrupt the desistance process. And the research tells us that what goes on in the process can actually have an impact on how long it goes on. And that's something to think about when we're dealing with crime and violent crime, especially among young people and young adults. The things that accelerate or aid in aging out of crime are things like a shift in self-identity, moving from having negative or deviant peer associations, reducing those, and moving to more positive peer associations, and developing a positive self-image and growing in your self-esteem. So institutions that are correlated to the move of aging out of crime are institutions like religion and the military and employment, and these other pro-social things. But there are also things that halt the natural process of aging out of crime, the things that make it that young people and young adults stay in criminality longer and into adulthood. And some of those are exposure to more deviant peers. Some of them are lack of access to resources and support, but they're also things like stigma and shame and resentment. And I want to spend a minute on resentment, because what the research talks about when it talks about resentment is that is like the sense of injustice and systemic bias that can build resentment in young people and halt their natural process of aging out of crime. In fact, one of the examples in the research is police arrests and incarceration can trigger mental health issues of stress and anxiety and depression, especially for young people of color. And young people and young adults who perceive the police and the justice system as unfair or experience bad treatment from police, they are more likely to build anger and resentment and have less respect for laws and the police, thereby elongating the process of desistance. And so separately, studies show that offenders who go through restorative justice see the process as more fair and more just than the traditional court system. And so, I think the point is that the way that we typically have done justice actually increases crime. It slows the natural process of young people maturing and aging out of crime. And that makes sense because court is shaming and it's stigmatizing. Incarceration is isolation. It's putting you with peers who are involved in criminality. It's a way, it takes you away from the institutions like school and family that promote desistance. And so some may say, okay, well, stop prosecuting kids. And there is research that supports that. But we know that that's really not possible, not when the harm is real and there are victims and there are communities that have been hurt or traumatized. And that's why my boss, the Attorney General in DC, so supports restorative justice, because the beauty of restorative justice is that it deals with crime. It deals with the accountability that needs to happen when crime is caused, but it's accountability directly to the victim. But it also promotes the things that help kids age out of crime. It promotes guilt, not shame. It promotes remorse, accountability, and redemption. It's a chance to hold up this terrible thing that you did against the person who you want to be and that you believe you can be. And it helps you by giving you things that you can do to show progress towards being that person. When a young person takes responsibility and does things that the victim asked them to do, he's able to affirm his good core self and juxtapose that with the bad decision he made, and not only say sorry, but also do sorry. This is how a person matures. This is how you build a positive self-image and self-esteem. And these are critical things to aging out of crime. In our program, Young people who are charged with serious violent crime go through restorative justice, and they're also required to do 10 to 12 weeks of group cognitive behavioral therapy sessions with a community-based therapist. And we included this in our requirements for restorative justice because the research is very, very, very clear that CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, is a proven behavior modification intervention. And what they do in CBT, I think, I'm not a therapist and I'm not involved in the sessions because they're all confidential, but my sense of what they do is they help the young person start to do role play situations where they can practice, get those grooves in their brains about like how to make the better decisions in the tough situation. What are the words to use? How do you think about your body when it's feeling anger, and how do you regulate that emotion and build self-control in a pro-social environment? And so what restorative justice does is it cultivates the things that help kids mature. And what the traditional prosecution and incarceration process does is maybe make it less likely that a young person will stop committing crime. And there, with restorative justice, there's of course failure. But even the research on desistance says that there will inevitably be a small portion of individuals who will defy the age crime curve and remain active in crime later in life. And for some youth in DC, we do fully prosecute and take them off the streets and out of their communities, but not many. Because when we overpunish, we push most of the youth into more crime. And so we have to be very careful about using these very damaging tools that we have. And restorative justice itself doesn't always work. First, we only go forward with the victim's permission. And instances in which the restorative justice conference, the dialogue itself doesn't work, or the young person doesn't stick to the agreement he promised, or he doesn't complete the required cognitive behavioral therapy, the case gets handed back to the prosecutor for traditional prosecution. But we've done over 250 restorative justice conferences, and less than 10 have been returned to the prosecutor for prosecution. And not all victims agree to do restorative justice. Some victims say, no, that's not what I want to do, and that's fine. But when our restorative justice facilitators sit with victims, even victims who've been really badly hurt, and hear about their pain and listen to their anger and kind of walk with them, far more of them than you would ever expect agree to do restorative justice. And those who do it come out far more satisfied than those who go to court. And some victims choose to do restorative justice because they are generous and they're charitable and they don't want to ruin a person's life. But some victims choose restorative justice even though they're really, really angry because they need something that the current process of court doesn't give them. Like, for instance, they have to walk around in the world and they may be worried about seeing this person who's hurt them again, or they may be worried about retaliation after prosecution. Oftentimes they have questions for the person who hurt them. This is apparently a trauma response. They have a lot of questions that need to be answered, even if the answers are not what they want. They need answers so they can create a narrative and push this experience to a different part of the brain and move past it. And not being able to ask questions makes it harder for them to kind of heal. They also want to see if the person who hurt them is truly sorry for what they did. They want to gauge the remorse of the person themselves. And sometimes they just really want to tell the person how badly they were hurt. And all of these things are important for their closure and their healing. And it turns out that all of the things that victims need and want from restorative justice track with all of the things that the person who caused the harm, the offender, really needs to hear and do in order to build empathy and consequential thinking and to change their behavior. And in DC, our preliminary data analysis shows that we see reduced recidivism among the young people who've done restorative justice, but that was kind of early analysis, and now we're doing a far more rigorous evaluation that we launched last year. It's also a randomized controlled trial. And we're also doing an evaluation to look into things more rigorously, like perceptions of justice and fairness and victim satisfaction. But we have been doing victim satisfaction surveys from the beginning, and we consistently get about 90% rates of victim satisfaction, asking victims questions like, are they satisfied with the process? Would they do it again if they were in a similar situation? Would they recommend it to a friend who is in a similar situation? And I think that's because in restorative justice, we give victims choice. And the ones who choose to do restorative justice feel really empowered by it. But those who don't are also empowered by the fact that they can make a choice. They can choose restorative justice or choose traditional prosecution. And we say if you choose restorative justice, you can always change your mind, because our process is very much victim-centered. And some victims, like I said, choose traditional prosecution, but most choose restorative justice. And what I've seen in my office is that over time, prosecutors understand the value of restorative justice. One thing that we did was we allowed a prosecutor to sit in on a restorative justice conference as an observer, one conference, one prosecutor at a time. And what we found is after they did, that prosecutor would send us more cases and send us more serious cases. And I would talk to the prosecutors after, and they would say things like, I can't believe that after such a traumatizing experience, that the victim is able to feel good about any experience with the person who hurt them. I can't believe that people who've been in such deep conflict can see each other as human beings and come to a resolution. We see this all the time in restorative justice. And I have the great privilege of being a public servant who works in our criminal justice system. And I feel that we are given this great power to work in the system, but we also have this opportunity and duty to make things better for the public, both for victims and for offenders. The juvenile justice system should have one single goal, and that is to help young people learn from their mistakes and stop committing crime. And yet we don't. The entire justice system is not effective at that. We have these core things that we should be trying to do with our justice system, and we keep failing. Our justice system does not help victims get closure or healing. In fact, there's research that shows that victims of crime say sometimes that the second worst thing to being the victim of crime was going through the criminal justice system. And that makes sense. They have very little voice or agency or power or control. They're just used as kind of a pawn in this court process. And recent research by the Department of Justice Bureau of Justice Statistics shows in its most recent recidivism analysis from a couple of years ago that the rate of recidivism among, I think, adults who come out of prison is 70%. 70% within 2 years, people who come out of our justice system commit more crime. So we're not making communities safer. We're not reducing crime. Clearly, we are not changing behavior, even though our system is called a correction system. And we're not supporting victims at all. And then we have overlaying all of this, the pernicious racial disparities that exist through every part of our justice system. Our system can't answer the very most important problems that we have. At every juncture in our system, we stigmatize, we shame, we dehumanize, we can't help victims. And we need to acknowledge that we're doing this. And we have to go back to first principles and think like, how do you change behavior? How do you support victims? How do you treat people, all people with dignity? Because we're not doing it in our system. And restorative justice isn't perfect, but it does have an impact on all of those levels. And just providing treatment to people who commit crime is also not satisfying. Right now, prosecutors basically have three choices in the world. They can prosecute, they can not prosecute, or they can divert to some sort of treatment. And even the treatment option, it is unsatisfying because it doesn't acknowledge accountability, right? You can give people treatment, but they still did something to hurt somebody. And the beauty of restorative justice is that a core part of it is accountability, and we use accountability to get to the outcomes we want for victims and for the offenders, which is healing and behavior change. Is it hard? Yes. Is it the answer for everything? No. Will some people and young people fail? Of course. But in Washington, D.C., we are dealing with serious violent crime with restorative justice, and we are getting better outcomes for victims and for offenders in terms of recidivism and behavior change with it. And so I encourage you also to do that. And given the kind of community support and infrastructure that already exists in your jurisdiction, I think you are well on your way.
Thank you, Seema. Wow, you've said so much, and my brain is just reeling here, but I appreciate every word that you've said. And thank you for sharing the stories that you did. I feel like I've met so many Darrens and Maliks in our community, boys. Things just get out of hand and it goes too far, and the impact and consequences, the impact is unintentional and the consequences can be so grave. So I appreciate you sharing that, and your willingness to sit in that circle and walk away from it with an open heart and open mind about restorative justice as well. We're going to move into our question and answer period. So I want to, one, acknowledge that there are questions coming through the Q&A function, and I want to encourage other audience members to do the same. And I also want to acknowledge that there are comments in the chat applauding your presentation. It was excellent and fabulous, and many people in the audience agree with you. So we're going to move into the questions and answers, and I do have a couple that I wanted to bring forth, and then we'll go to the Q&A function as well. You talked about restorative justice in such a rich way, and I know that there are many principles and values attached to that. I'm just wondering, what were those guiding principles or the North Star of your office that keeps you all focused and grounded on moving forward?
That's a really good question. I feel like over the time that I've been doing this work, the things that have been really important to keep focused on for me have kind of changed and evolved, and like kind of the things I think about have changed over time. But I know when we first started doing this work at a prosecutor's office, which is highly unusual, I was really, really worried about things like net widening. I was worried about prosecutors or judges or others who actually were well-intentioned and bought into restorative justice wanting to use it with young people that they would have otherwise not prosecuted, and then pulling them into this system. This, I learned when I was at the foundation, happens a lot with new kind of progressive diversion programs, that they're targeted at kind of the more worthy people. That tends to be younger people, less risky people. And then what happens is the net gets too broad, and you bring in people who would have otherwise been dismissed because of those same factors. And then you pull them into the justice system, because then if they fail, you have to respond. And so net widening was really important for me to be vigilant about. And so we created little systems in our office to make sure that nobody could send us a case unless they'd already independently made the decision that they were going to prosecute the case. And if they were going to dismiss the case, they should send it to what we had was a far more sparse and nascent restorative justice community. And, you know, it's so exciting to hear about the extensive work of Friends of Restorative Justice and the Dispute Resolution Center, because we had none of that, but there was a little bit. And so we created a program where we could send some of those cases completely to that. And so there was no criminal consequences for failure in those contexts. The other thing I was really concerned about, again, being at a prosecutor's office, was that we could build trust with the young people who are in the justice system and their families, knowing that among the people in our justice system, frankly, they are almost all kids of color, and they're almost all poor. And there's a great deal of distrust of the justice system. And so it was really important for me, when we were given the privilege and opportunity to hire restorative justice facilitators, to make sure that our facilitators looked like the kids who were in our justice system. Some had experience being justice involved themselves, and that they would all have the ability to be culturally relevant to the young people and their families. And so that was of great importance to me early on and continues to be to this day. And we have just the most amazing facilitators on staff. It also was like an added benefit of that was changing the makeup of our prosecutor's office. We had to like change the HR rules about if you could hire somebody with a criminal record, for instance, for a couple of our facilitators, and that was good. That was right. Um, and But I used to think a lot about the fact that maybe young people are moved in these experiences because even the person that they hurt shows compassion towards them.
Mhm.
I think that compassion must play a big role in this. Um, and I also thought a lot about the fact that, like, I think this is supposed to be about the fact that communities can solve their own problems if given the right space. That government doesn't need to come in and solve problems for people because that doesn't usually work that well anyway. Um, right now I think a lot about recidivism because I feel like I have a lot of pressure because we're doing this really rigorous study on recidivism. And I know that there's far more important things to restorative justice than just recidivism reduction. I know that it is incredibly valuable that we treat all of these folks with dignity, that we build strong connections between our facilitators and these young people that don't involve judgment or shame. I know that even the parents of young people feel shamed in court and they don't with restorative justice, and that victims get more out of it. But I also know that as a political matter, there is a great deal of pressure with this to show that it reduces recidivism. And there are a lot of people that are betting that it doesn't work. And I think that it needs to work. So I think a lot about how are we going to change behavior of young people.
Great, thank you. Yeah, thank you. I think as we continue to prepare to work broadly or to broaden our practice around restorative justice, we're very sensitive to having to have it values driven. So I just wanted to kind of hear where you are on that. Something you said about the kinds of cases in your presentation, you said that there were low-level crimes and now you're doing more serious crimes. Did something change in that trajectory, or what changed in that trajectory, or did you plan that from the very beginning?
It certainly didn't plan any of this, but I think I realized along the way that it was really important for us. Again, I have this great opportunity. I'm at a prosecutor's office with an elected prosecutor who cares deeply about this and who's willing to be courageous and brave in the face of pressure around crime and justice to support this. We have a city council that's given us resources to do this. And there are other programs around the country that do restorative justice for low-level offenses. And there are a couple that deal with more serious offenses. But I think the big questions out there about restorative justice are, is it operationalized? Can you operationalize it? Can you really make it work within a system? Can you scale it? And also, can it handle real crime? Like real serious crime? These are open questions that I think need to be answered. And I'm in this very, very privileged position to be able to push the envelope and see. And so it's really important, as you suggest, Belinda, that we are very closely connected to the fidelity and the values of restorative justice, that we put all of our heart and soul into doing it right. Because I think that there is going to be a time at which folks look at us to answer those questions. And it was important that we contributed not only to our city, but also to the field in this way. So while I didn't plan it initially, when I first started, I was just trying to see if we can get buy-in from prosecutors and get them okay with this. But as we did that, as we accomplished those goals, then it became clear to me that I needed to be able to see if this can scale and if this works on serious crime. And I believe, I know I told you I'm scared of our evaluation and recidivism, but I believe that it does, because we see that it does. Preliminary results show that it does, and other research shows that it does work.
Yeah. yeah. I want to move to questions that are coming from our audience. We have a few here, and I'd like to get as many in as possible. I'm just going to go down the list as I see them. One question from, well, let me see. I'm sorry.
Take your
the
time.
technology is, okay, I want to cite them or state them in the order that they came in. So can you comment on patterns that you have observed concerning whether or not victims agree to pursue restorative justice in lieu of the traditional processing?
Yes, that's a great question, and one that I was worried about as well in the beginning. What I have found is that we actually have a high rate of victims agreeing to do restorative justice, even in serious cases, more than I think that I haven't run the numbers recently, but maybe a year ago I ran the numbers, and it was, I think, about 25% of victims declined, but that means that 75% that were asked agreed to do restorative justice, which is a very high rate.
That's a high
Yeah.
rate, yeah.
What I think is, I think it's in part because restorative justice is great, but I also think it's in part because our justice system is terrible. Victims really get so very little out of our justice system. The options are so rigid and so limiting that sometimes they kind of decide to do restorative justice a little bit later. They're like, no, that's not something I'm interested in. Then they continue to talk to the prosecutor about what the rest of it is going to look like. And then they're like, well, maybe I actually want to do that thing because this doesn't feel good either. And one thing that I think one of the things I've come to appreciate more than ever over time is the value of taking good care of our victims, because the success and the healing of the victim is very much tied to the success and healing of the young person who's been charged. And I wouldn't have said that, I think, in the beginning, and maybe it doesn't really make sense, but the more that you can, in preparation for the Restorative Justice Conference, really empathize with and prepare and walk with the victim of the crime, the more they are going to be in a position to get what they need, which is to say that they were really badly hurt, to ask the questions they want, to ask for the things that they want, but they're also then, when they feel better, able to show compassion and dignity and care, even to the person who hurt them. And what's fascinating and beautiful in some ways is that oftentimes, when a victim has been hurt, they've lost power and control, right? Their life has been destabilized. And the justice system doesn't help you in gaining control. But what helps in actually after any trauma in healing is having choice and agency and voice, and restorative justice provides that. And over time, as you are giving that, as you are kind of supported by this facilitator, as you process everything, and then you get to this final conversation with the young person and their family, what ends up happening often is that the victim actually feels a lot of power and even healing in showing grace to the person who hurt them and wanting better for that person, which is an incredible transformation.
Absolutely, absolutely incredible. We have a question that's asking about when you do have to prosecute fully, is there a restorative process post-conviction? And if so, what does it look like?
Unfortunately, we don't have that in Washington, D.C.
Okay.
We don't have the capacity to do that.
That's a very interesting question. I would wonder if there's some research out there to that effect. Thank you for that question, Tina. It's something for us to look further into. So who's doing the follow-up with the person who harmed, making sure that that person is following through on their commitments? And how long does it take? And I'm wondering, how long would a case stay open, or the average length of time?
Yeah, that's a great question. So our facilitators play that role. Our cases, the whole restorative justice process with monitoring tends to be between 6 and 9 months. And our facilitator is in close communication and work with both the victims and their supporters and the young person and their family for that whole process. And there's a lot of time of the preparation Our young people, as I mentioned, also go through cognitive behavioral therapy during that period of time. So for 10 to 12 weeks, they're going to weekly group sessions of therapy. And it's hard to get kids to go to therapy. And it turns out that if it's just somebody saying you are supposed to go to therapy, they don't go. But if it's our facilitators who build trust with the kids and connection with the kids, who call them to remind them every week to go, and call them if they don't go one day and tell them, why didn't you show up? Or stop by their house or whatever, then the kids go to therapy. So our facilitators are working with them for many, many weeks. And then after the time of the Restorative Justice Conference, when everyone comes to the consensus agreement about what everyone needs to do, typically what the young person needs to do to make it right, there's those agreements are very kind of concrete about until when, how many times, all of those things. And our facilitator monitors that.
Okay.
And anything that involves the victim, the facilitator is still in touch with the victim to make sure, did you receive the restitution? Did you get your, if you asked to be in touch with the kid, did they call you? So they're working with both of them and monitoring.
That's great. So that relationship between the facilitator and those in the circle seems to be invaluable in getting people to carry out.
Yeah, I think it's actually one of the important parts of this.
Yeah, sounds like it. So you mentioned that your program requires that cases that get referred are cases that would be prosecuted, so that you won't have this swelling of cases, of those cases or those incidents that would not get prosecuted. So the question is, when should RJ be offered in the judicial process? What is the best practice? So are you offering it as early as possible, or?
It's a really good question. We don't offer it as early as we probably in like a perfect world would want to, because we know, well, the research states that the more deeply a young person penetrates into the justice system, the worse their life outcomes are going to be. Isn't that terrible? So if you compare a person who committed a crime and goes through the justice system, a young person, a child, compared to another young person who has a similar background in terms of criminal history, commits the same crime and doesn't go through the justice system, then life outcomes for the kid in the justice system will be worse. So they're less likely to graduate from high school, more likely to commit more crime, less likely to ultimately get a job and get married, more likely to get involved in risky sexual behavior, all of these bad outcomes. And so given that kind of information, I think a lot of restorative justice folks feel like the closer you can keep this to the community, the better. And the more you penetrate into the justice system, the worse. And so when we were taking lower level crime, we were actually trying to do it at the very earliest stages, and that is like right after arrest, before we even prosecuted or papered the case. And we would try and check with the prosecutor to make sure they would in fact prosecute the case if it had come to them. But so for the net widening concern that you mentioned, Belinda, but we would in many cases take it very early on. But once we moved into taking the serious violent crime, what became very clear is that prosecutors were not going to send those cases that early to restorative justice for various reasons. And so, but we knew it was important for us to take those cases. And so one of the compromises was waiting until it had gone further in. So I don't know what best practices is. I think that what we're doing is what in the realm of what is possible. And one of the things I like dream about is that with the work that we're doing, it can create political cover for other jurisdictions and other folks to kind of iterate it in even better ways and make it better and more expansive. And
it will continue to evolve as time goes on and we have more data as well. I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about the controlled studies that you mentioned. The question is, how do you do the randomized controlled studies without randomly denying people the opportunity to have a restorative process?
It's an excellent question. And we spent a lot of time with these researchers about this very question. And having to explain it to prosecutors and others because it is kind of a thorny question. The way that the researchers really designed our randomized control trial was basically that all of the eligible cases would come in, and every week we would look at all of the eligible cases that have already been kind of decided to be prosecuted. And then a randomizer would be used based on the capacity of our facilitators. So the truth is that we couldn't, at this point in our program, we can't take all of the cases. We just don't have enough staff to take all of the cases that exist. And what was happening when we left it to the discretion of the prosecutors about which cases we got and which cases we didn't get based on our capacity, what was happening is that there was a bit of bias in just whose desk you landed on for your crime. So we had some prosecutors who loved restorative justice and sent us all of their cases. And then we had some prosecutors who never sent us any of their cases. So it was a bit of a lottery anyway, but it was kind of biased, right? It depended on whose case, what prosecutor was assigned to your case, whether you had a shot at restorative justice or not. And so by randomizing it and basically saying, okay, this week, the facilitators have the capacity to take 3 new cases. We're going to randomize for 3 cases. And it's kind of a lottery who is going to be eligible for restorative justice. So who would go into the treatment group as opposed to the control group. That's a lottery too. But it's not that we're denying people. We would have never had capacity for everyone anyway. And this way, at least it's kind of blind. It's more fair because, you have the same shot as anybody else as opposed to which prosecutor you got.
I want to build a little bit upon the criteria, the eligible cases. So what are the criteria that you use to determine a case is eligible?
So I think it's fantastic. It's so exciting. And it was met with a lot of pushback and skepticism at my office among prosecutors. But because of the rigors of a randomized control trial, it means that the prosecutors actually have to lose discretion in choosing which cases they send and which cases they don't. Because if you were to study the program, if prosecutors were sending you cases, you wouldn't know if the kids who went through restorative justice maybe were more successful because restorative justice worked or because the prosecutor picked the cases that were going to be more successful. So there was this selection bias problem. So with randomizing it, you take that away. And what we heard from prosecutors is we bring a lot of insight to the table, and they might, but we'll be able to now see with this randomized control trial, are there types of cases that statistically are more likely to be successful using restorative justice than others? Are there people with a certain criminal history versus another criminal history that are more likely to be successful, et cetera? And that's going to be incredibly valuable information for prosecutors to know once the study is over. But our eligibility criteria are that we rule out any homicide case. We also rule out any case where the young person is being investigated for any homicide, even if that case itself isn't a homicide. There kind of is an open investigation. We also rule out any sexual assault case and any domestic violence intimate partner cases. And then the last thing is that we rule out all misdemeanors and only take violent offenses. The thing that we don't rule out, which I think is really, really important and powerful, is we don't rule out anybody for their criminal history. And that I think
very
will be
interesting.
Really, very interesting. We have some cases with young people with very extensive criminal history, and the prosecutors are very nervous about using restorative justice in those cases. And then we also have some cases where the young people, it's their first offense with a serious crime.
Wow, thank you for sharing that. That's very interesting. Our next question is also talking about the kinds of offenses. In our county, in Washtenaw County specifically, we are looking at what some might consider lower level offenses, high misdemeanors, low level felonies. What are your thoughts on how members of the community and Friends of Restorative Justice specifically in engaging our prosecutor's office and maybe the judges on looking at serious offenses. I'm wondering, how did your office make that leap? Are there things we should be thinking about as we think more about more serious offenses?
Well, one thing is I'd love to send to you all the study that shows that there are better outcomes for serious offenses than the lower level offenses. I thought that was fascinating. And I think when I think about it, it makes sense to me because where somebody has been more harmed, the young person builds more empathy, right? If
Yeah.
somebody had, their iPhone stolen, and they could afford an iPhone in the first place, like they're pissed off, but like they're not that badly hurt, right? And so the conversation about the harm is maybe less impactful because it's less harm than where somebody is, has had a very serious crime committed to them, which I think is, I should say that sometimes people have been harmed by things that we consider low level, and the harm is quite great. And so
Mhm.
it is important not to minimize the feelings of harm of victims because everyone is different in how they receive things. Everybody has gone through their own past history of trauma, and
Mhm.
these things can come up. But generally speaking, it feels a little bit like when somebody has been more badly hurt, it affects the kid who hurt them more because they feel really bad about it when they have to hear from that person and when they have to answer their questions and talk to them. So that's one thing that I would say. The other thing I would say is that at least in my office, the transition, the fact that, we started with lower level cases in part because it was very important to me, at least, to build buy-in
Mhm.
from the prosecutors. And I knew that with a newly elected progressive district, attorney general in our case, or district attorney in other places, there's a lot of trepidation and concern by line prosecutors who've sometimes been there for a long, long time. And it was, I think, in the long run, it was going to be harder if it was forced upon them for them to ultimately be open to the value of restorative justice. So for us, it was important to start with the cases that they were willing to give us and create some guardrails around net widening and making sure, the case was going to be prosecuted, making sure that they were substantive cases, even in the lower level cases. We're not going to take shoplifting cases pretty much. Uh, but we will take simple assaults, that kind of thing. So there were some guardrails, but we had to really make the case to prosecutors about why these things are valuable, and there are cases to be made. And prosecutors, even resistant prosecutors, they will acknowledge that they see cases come across their desk all the time, and even if they're very bought into the current system, they will acknowledge that there are some cases that just don't feel right for prosecution.
Mm.
They know that if they prosecute two people who've had a long history before and then they go back into the community together, like it's not going to make things better. They'll acknowledge that. So we used to have a prosecutor who would send us any case where the two people knew each other. That was their thing. And then we had some case where the prosecutor sat in on a restorative justice conference where somebody had something robbed of them, and she had such a good experience that any robbery she would send us, right? So like slowly like kind of build appreciation for
Yeah.
the value of restorative justice, and we wanted to let that happen because we wanted them to really believe in it. And at every stage of pushing, when we went to the more serious cases, when we went to the randomized control trial, there was a lot of resistance, even among supporters.
Mhm.
And so we were impatient, but not too impatient, I think.
We have questions, a couple questions in the Q&A regarding the study. So I'm going to let the audience know that we will work with Seema to get a copy of those studies. And if possible, we'll get those links posted so that members of the community can look at those studies as well. But I do appreciate those questions. We have another question about juveniles and law enforcement. Would you be able to discuss how RJ works with them, or if it's been done before? Or
You
have
know,
you experienced that?
I have this like secret dream that one day restorative justice could be used by police officers in communities as a way for police officers to both help communities that are experiencing conflict among them, bring them together and help them, even if the police officer doesn't do the circle, but help them build community ties and solve problems, much like the Dispute Resolution Center does for communities. Because I think that that would also contribute to police and communities improving the relationship between them. Because we meet young people all the time who are in the justice system. And one of the many things that feels really heartbreaking to me is that you have young people who live in communities where there is crime and violence, sometimes have crime and violence in their schools. And my kids grow up and, as when they were little, if something bad happened, they would always say, well, then the policeman is going to get them and throw them in jail. And I don't know how, I know that it's got to be really damaging for young people to not believe that there is somebody there to keep them safe in their communities, to feel like the one person, the one entity that is supposed to keep them safe would maybe harm them. I think that's heartbreaking, and it's probably really damaging to kids. So I think improving police community relationships is something we should all deeply care about for the sake of these kids, for sure. And I believe that restorative justice has this power to do that. We live in such a polarized and political environment, and yet when you put people in a circle and you have them talk in kind of like a safe and vulnerable space, even people who disagree really vehemently about stuff, they can really find humanity in the other. So I'm going off on a tangent. I'll answer your question by saying that we have never had police officers run restorative justice circles in Washington, D.C. However, we have had a bunch of cases, not a bunch, maybe like a handful of cases, where the victim of the crime is a police officer. There are assault on a police officer cases.
Oh.
Isn't that interesting? So we've had restorative justice circles where our victim is a police officer. And sometimes we've had police officers who are victims, and we'll call them and ask them if they'd be interested in this. And they're like, no way, this is garbage. This is tree hugging, soft on crime, blah, blah, blah. But we've actually had several police officers say, yeah, I'd really like to do this. And I've facilitated a couple of them and sat in on a couple more of them. And they are some of the most fascinating conversations, because these folks often have a lot that they need to say to each other or want to say to each other. I've had, in almost all of the situations, you end up having the police officer talk about why they went into policing, why they became a police officer, because they feel, one of them straight up said, I didn't go into being a police officer because I wanted to lock up Black boys. But every time I go into the community, that's what people see me as. And kids look at me and they scream pig and they say F the police. And it feels terrible, because that's not why I'm here. That's not why I did this. Let me tell you about why I was inspired to be a police officer. And then on the other side, we have kids and their family members who talk about how it feels to be surveilled, to believe that police officers are watching them because they assume the worst of them, and what it feels like to be handcuffed and then sat on the curb for an hour as people walk by, when their paperwork is being processed, and how humiliating that is. These are important things that need to be said. And what happens in those conferences is kind of cool. And one of the conferences, the police officer and the young person, they agreed that they were going to check in once a week for 2 months, and they became good friends. Another police officer offered the boy to, I don't want you to run over time, offered to take the boy on a ride along, and the boy was like, no way, I can't be seen with you.
Not in the car with the police.
Right, no, it's not gonna happen. But one kid I remember said, I've never had a police officer as a friend. And so they're really, they are really powerful conversations too. I think there's potential there. Maybe I'm just dreaming.
Well, we remain hopeful. In our last minute or so for questions, that I know we do have to wrap up, folks, so I apologize that we couldn't get to all of the questions, but I am also curious, as one of our audience members is curious, what is the vision going forward for your office over the next few years?
My vision is to, and I know this sounds dramatic, but my vision is to transform our juvenile justice system in DC. I would like it to be the case that for all victims of crime, restorative justice is the default and offered to them. And for all young people who've been charged with crime, that restorative justice is the first effort. And when somebody wants to go to trial or test the evidence, as they have a constitutional right to do so, only then do we use our criminal justice system and our trial system, that it is the prosecutors who are the exception and the facilitators who are the rule. And I think that's important because I think it's good and right for our city. But I also think it's important because I think if we can do that, or even get close to that, even be able to say that 80% of our cases are offered restorative justice, or 75% of our cases in a city with real serious crime, you know, and that the sky doesn't fall when that happens, I think it does create, I think it changes the goalposts for everyone who's working on juvenile justice about what real reform could look like and what real progress in terms of making a fairer, more just system should be about.
Thank you, Seema. Thank you so much for being here and sharing your experience and your knowledge and wisdom with us as we continue on our journey here in Washtenaw County to implement restorative justice in our criminal legal system. I've learned a lot. You've affirmed me in some ways as well. I feel like we're on the right track, and I appreciate your voice so much, and I hope it's okay to continue to reach out to you for your expertise. I'm sure members of the audience are applauding your presentation. And again, I'm sorry that I could not get to all of your questions, but we will have your questions answered and posted on the website. So thank you all for it. And yes, this is recorded and the recording will be posted on the DRC's website as well. So thank you all. Now I'm going to turn it over back over to Kathy, who will close us out.
Just a couple more minutes. Thank you so much, Seema. I've heard you before, but I learned a lot of new things today that I'll value, and excellent questions from the audience. I also want to thank a couple other organizations who co-sponsored this event, the Michigan Center for Youth Justice, the Michigan Collaborative to End Mass Incarceration, and the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Ann Arbor. We want this to be one of a series of educational events about restorative justice. We plan to have about 2 more this year. We don't have the dates scheduled yet, but if you registered on Zoom, we have your email address. We'll let you know. And you can also visit the Dispute Resolution Center's website or Friends of Restorative Justice website, and we'll post the events and how to register there. If you're interested in promoting restorative justice or getting trained to facilitate restorative justice, because the Dispute Resolution Center uses a lot of volunteers as well as paid staff, you can contact the Dispute Resolution Center for training, or you can contact Friends of Restorative Justice to help spread the message and learn more about it. And you can contact us by visiting our website. So I want to thank everyone for coming, especially Seema and Belinda. And I hope everyone has a good night, and thank you.